Jason and I were setting up camp at a lookout spot along Lake Ridge Road in northern Montana on New Year's Eve. We'd driven 3 hours into the mountain to get away from the hospital. Both of us worked in emergency medicine, and it was our tradition to trade crowds and noise for silence and stars before we started a fresh year. The forecast said light snow. The road was mostly clear when we started that afternoon, but by the time we reached the turnout around dusk, the storm was getting worse. The sky looked so heavy, one could barely see 50 feet. We probably should have turned back, but we were already there. We'd just gotten out to stretch when I saw someone coming from the trees. At first, I thought maybe a hiker or ranger was checking on people before the storm got worse. But as he got closer, I saw he was limping badly, clutching his left arm. His face was in twisted pain. He collapsed to one knee in the snow about 20 feet from us and started yelling that his wife had fallen off a ridge, was hurt badly, and maybe bleeding out. He begged us to come help. Jace and I didn't even hesitate. Years of training kicked in as Jace grabbed our trauma kit from the trunk while I got blankets and headlamps. In the rush, we forgot to grab our phones. The man kept saying his wife was dying, that it was close, and that we must hurry. We followed him into a narrow trail, cutting between thick pines. The snow muffled everything except our breathing and boots. We walked about 5 minutes, heading deeper into the woods. That's when I started noticing how the man's limp was changing. It had been dramatic when he first approached us, but now it was barely there. And the usual panic and urgency of a person whose wife was almost dying was very obviously missing. Instead, he was just walking and glancing back occasionally to make sure we were following. I whispered to Jace that something felt off. He nodded, but kept moving. If there really was someone injured, we couldn't risk not helping. But just as we took a steep turn towards the denser side, 2 men stepped out from behind a large boulder. They were dressed in heavy furs and had their faces covered. One had a rifle slung over his shoulder. The other was holding a metal pipe with a flashlight duct taped to it. The limping man dropped the act immediately. He straightened up and shook out his arm like he'd been holding it stiff for too long as he stepped back toward the other 2. My stomach dropped. Jace went rigid beside me. The man with the rifle told us to hand over everything we were carrying. His voice was flat, almost bored, like he'd done this before. Jace quietly handed over his wallet, his watch, and the chain he was wearing. I handed over my possessions too. They asked for our phones. We told them we'd forgotten them in our car. They asked Jace to pass the keys over. Jace slowly opened his palm, but right before the guy with the rifle could snatch it, Jace fumbled and dropped them into the snow. Sensing his plan, I took tiny steps back and waited. Just as the man bent down to pick them up, Jace elbowed him in the ribs and yelled at me to run as he himself took off in the opposite direction. I bolted. Behind me, gunshots cracked. Something hit the snow to my left, but I didn't stop. I kept running and slipping. The branches whipped my face, and cold burned in my lungs. I heard them behind me, but the storm was getting worse, and the visibility was dropping. I didn't know where I was going, just downhill toward where the road might be. My legs were burning. My hands were numb. I'd lost a glove and couldn't feel my fingers. I kept running and thinking about Jace, whether he'd made it or they'd gone after him instead. Then, through the trees, I saw the yellow lights. A snowplow was grinding up the main road. I crashed out of the woods onto the shoulder, waving both arms, and screamed. The driver hit the brakes hard. He pulled me into the cab and asked what happened. I tried to explain, but my teeth were chattering so hard I could barely talk. He called it in and drove me to where the rescue teams could meet us. I sat in the back of an ambulance for what felt like hours. I couldn't stop shaking and kept asking about Jace. But nobody knew anything. They wrapped me in blankets and checked me for frostbite. My fingers were turning white at the tips. They found Jace about 2 hours later. He'd managed to circle back toward the road on his own. bruised and shaken, but alive. He said he'd lost them in the thicker part of the woods and heard them searching for a while before they finally gave up. When I saw him walking toward me, I started crying. By the time the police got to the turnout, our car was gone. The snow had filled every footprint and tire track. The officers said they'd notified nearby stations, but I saw it in their faces. They weren't going to find those men or our vehicle. A ranger told me a few weeks later that there had been other disappearances along that ridge. But the cases went nowhere because the Montana wilderness in winter is huge, and it's easy to vanish if you know how. I kept thinking about what would have happened if only one of us had gone to help. I'm 29 now. That was 3 years ago. I still work in emergency medicine, but I don't go camping anymore. Don't drive mountain roads in winter. And when someone comes into the ER with an urgent story about a family member who needs help, I call security first. Riley and I were driving through the mountains of West Virginia on New Year's Eve, heading to my grandmother's cabin, farther up that ridge. She lived alone up there, and we promised to spend the holiday with her. The forecast called for light flurries, but anyone who's driven the mountain roads knows the weather does what it wants when you get into the higher elevation. We left around 8 that evening. By 11, we were deep into the mountains, where the trees pressed close to the road and houses disappeared completely. Snow was falling steadily, the kind that sticks to everything and makes the world go quiet. Riley had been working doubles all week and could barely keep her eyes open. She asked if we could pull over so she could rest. I told her to climb in the back. She was out within seconds, curled up under her blanket. Riley slept like the dead. As I kept driving, the snow got heavier, turning into ice pellets that tapped against the windshield. My headlights could barely cut through the white ahead. Suddenly, the car jolted, like I'd rolled over something on the road. The dashboard lights flickered. The engine sputtered twice before it died, and everything went pitch dark. I groaned and tried the ignition, but it whined and died over and over. My phone showed 3% and barely 1 bar of signal. Outside, the road stretched empty in both directions. I squinted but couldn't see any shed visible anywhere. I got out into the freezing air and popped the hood, used my phone's flashlight and looked at the wiring, even though I didn't really know what I was looking for. The cold bit through my jacket immediately. The storm muffled everything. Even the trees seemed to lean in closer. I was contemplating waking up Riley when I saw the headlights approaching from behind. A dark SUV rolled to a stop about 20 feet back, and a man got out. He was big, maybe in his 40s, wearing a thick jacket and work gloves. He walked up with this casual, friendly expression, but something about him felt wrong. His eyes were too alert, like he'd been expecting to find someone out here. He asked if I was okay and said the road was a graveyard tonight. His voice was warm enough, but there was something weird about it. I explained that my car had just died. He came over and leaned in under the hood next to me and peered at the engine. He smelled like cigarettes and something sour. He said the battery was cooked and the engine was too far gone to fix. Said I'd freeze if I stayed and suggested I come with him to the next town and figure the rest out once the storm passed. I thanked him and lied about already having a tow truck on the way. He insisted no tow truck would make it through and that it was getting colder. I turned back to the engine, trying to look busy, trying not to show how scared I was. I thought maybe he'd take a hint and go away. Instead, he stepped closer. His voice dropped lower, almost bored now, like he was tired of pretending. He said I was getting in his car whether I wanted to or not. Then, he grabbed my arm. I jerked back and tried to yell, but he clamped his hand over my mouth and shoved me hard against the side of my car. My phone fell into the snow. I could feel his breath on my face. He was saying something about not making this difficult, about how far we were from anyone who could help. Somehow, I bit into his palm and screamed Riley's name before he clamped my mouth shut again. That's what woke Riley up. I heard the back door fly open, Riley shouting his name, confused and half asleep, but alert enough to know something was wrong. The man froze. His hand was still over my mouth, but he'd gone completely still. He hadn't known anyone else was in the car. Riley scrambled out, still tangled in the blanket, yelling louder now. The man let go of me like I'd burned him. He backed up, his eyes moving fast between Riley and me. I could see it on his face. 2 people meant witnesses. He wouldn't want to take the risk. He didn't say anything else, just turned and ran back to his SUV, got in, and peeled out into the icy road, his taillights disappearing into the snow within seconds. Riley helped me back to the car. My cheek was already swelling where he'd shoved me. My hands were shaking. Riley called 911. The police took nearly an hour to arrive. They searched the road with flashlights, but the snow had covered everything. I described everything I remembered about him and his car. One of the officers told me that this wasn't the first report like this on New Year's week. Said there had been others over the years. He said the man knew these roads, when to wait, and how to pick his targets. It took me a while to understand what had saved me. The man had thought I was alone. He watched me get out of my car by myself, watched me struggle with the hood. He assumed I was isolated, vulnerable, and easy. But Riley had been there the whole time, sleeping in the back seat. He hadn't seen her, hadn't known. And the moment he realized I wasn't alone, he ran. I survived because I had company. I'm 23 now. That was 2 years ago. I don't drive mountain roads at night anymore. Can't do it. Even with other people in the car, my hands start shaking the moment the sun goes down and the trees close in. Riley and I don't talk about it much. She feels guilty sometimes for not staying awake. I tell her that's stupid. She saved my life by being there. But sometimes, late at night, I think about him and all the other women on those roads. The ones who were actually alone and didn't make it to their grandmother's house. It was New Year's Eve, 2019. I was driving home from a late shift at the Wildlife Rehab Center where I worked. My only company for the drive was Bax, my Australian Kelpie, who usually rode in the back seat pretty quietly. The route I took was County Road 314. It cut through miles of dormant almond orchards where most of the farm workers had gone home for winter. The night was unusually still, with no wind or traffic except for my headlights and the dark shapes of trees on either side. About halfway into the trip, Bax started whining. At first, I thought he just wanted attention, but he stood up and started pacing in the back seat. I realized he needed to pee. I found a break in the orchard rows, pulled over, and left the engine running with the headlights on. The air was cold and damp when I stepped out. I opened the back door, and Bax jumped out, sniffing around the edge of the trees. He didn't wander far until I heard a loud crash echoed from somewhere in the woods. It was heavy and deliberate, like someone moving through the trees. Before I could react, Bax bolted straight into the orchard and disappeared within seconds. I yelled his name over and over, but there was no sight of him. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and went after him. The beam barely cut through the darkness. I kept calling his name and kept moving deeper between the rows. I was moving through a narrow clearing when my foot suddenly dropped into nothing. I fell forward, hard, landing in a shallow pit about 2 feet deep. My phone flew out of my hand, and the flashlight beam spun wildly before landing face down in the dirt. The pit was maybe 4 feet across, worn smooth at the edges like vehicles had been driving over the spot repeatedly. I could feel the tire ruts carved into the packed earth. That's when I heard the voices, coming from somewhere close by. A blunt, wet thud through the trees, followed by a muffled groan. My blood went cold. I grabbed my phone and killed the flashlight. I scrambled out of the pit and crawled to the nearest tree, pressing myself flat against the trunk. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Bax appeared beside me with his body low and tail tucked. He was trembling. I'd never seen him like that before. A few rows away, the voices rose. They were business-like laborers at work. I heard shovels scraping dirt and plastic rustling. One of them said something that made my stomach drop. He told the others to bury the body carefully. I needed to leave, needed to get back to my car and drive away as fast as possible. When I reached down to grab Bax, my hand touched the ground and resulted in a snap. Suddenly, those men stopped talking. One of them whistled. Another answered from a different direction. They'd heard me. They know someone's in here watching them. I scooped Bax into my arms and started moving, fast but trying to stay quiet. I was trying not to snap branches anymore or breathe too loud. The footsteps behind me got louder. They were spreading out and moving through the orchard in a line. I broke into a run, dodging between trees and clutching Bax against my chest. When I reached the edge, I could see my car through the branches. The headlights were still glowing, but as I got closer, I spotted movement near the driver's door. A man was leaning against the hood, smoking. He'd been waiting for me. My keys were in my pocket. There was no way to get in without him seeing me. Behind me, the footsteps got closer. I was boxed in. I made a split-second decision. Instead of going for the car, I veered hard left and ran parallel to the road. The man by the car shouted something into the orchard, and the formation shifted. They were herding me. I ran until my lungs screamed and until my legs felt like they'd give out. I spotted a small concrete irrigation hut half buried in the weeds. I ducked inside and pulled Bax down with me, pressing my hand over his muzzle to keep him quiet. Flashlight beams swept past the entrance. Boots crunched on gravel just outside. A radio crackled, and one of them said they'd lost visual. I stayed frozen and didn't move. Minutes stretched on forever, but eventually, it got quiet again. I waited another 20 minutes before I even tried to move. When I finally crept back toward the road, my car was still there, but the driver's side window was smashed, with glass everywhere. They even shattered my headlights. I got in with shaky hands, started the car, and drove without headlights on down the dark road. It was risky, but at least I was away from those men. I drove 5 miles before I stopped to check Bax again. He was shaking in terror. I got home around 1 a.m. My dad was still up, waiting. He asked why I was so late, and I told him traffic had been bad. He looked at me like he knew I was lying, but he didn't push it. A few days later, I mentioned what happened that night to someone I trusted in the sheriff's department, off the record. They told me that area was a known route for things being done. I was better off not knowing. They said reporting anything publicly would put me and my dad at risk, and advised to forget I was ever on County Road 314 that night. I didn't sleep for weeks after that. How could I, when I knew I came seconds close to disappearing, dead, or worse, because I stopped at the wrong place at the wrong time?